I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is the 199th episode of this podcast, dedicated to anything and everything that you can do to help the better performance of your own brain, which it goes without saying means avoiding Alzheimer's disease. More easily said than done, of course. Alzheimer's is a nut that has not quite been cracked by medical science, probably still a long way off. And one of the things that makes it complicated is there seem to be so many different factors that have some correlation on whether a person winds up getting the disease. But one factor that nobody is denying is the diet. And a little over a year ago, something called the MIND diet was announced by researchers, cherry-picking elements of the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet in a combination that seems to be one of the most brain-healthy diets ever. And in the main interview, I'm going to be speaking with Dr. Martha Morris, the human mind behind the MIND diet, hearing about how the diet came about, what we know about its effects now, what we might reasonably suspect, and what we're still hoping to learn. If you hang around until the very end of the episode, in the Ruthless Listener Retention gimmick, I'm going to keep it food-themed. A little-known fact about me, but now you know, is that I really don't like cheese. There's no kind of cheese that I like. Even as a kid, I just did not like cheese. But there has recently been a study into the neural basis for cheese disgust, so you can find out why people like me even exist in the Ruthless Listener Retention gimmick. But for right now, let's kick things off, as usual, with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
Since this episode is going to be primarily about diet, and one of the concerns that everybody has with diet is somehow using your willpower to force yourself to eat what you know to be the right thing or you suspect to be the right thing, even though it's not necessarily what you want to eat, I figured it would be useful to talk again about willpower, something for which there's been a lot of studies and counter-studies and counter-counter-studies in recent years, many of them looking at our daily rhythms. Is willpower a depletable asset over the course of the day? You basically start with a stockpile in the morning and make repeated withdrawals from it throughout the day until by the end of the day you're unable to say no to even the slightest temptation. That is one view, but it is not the view that is well held up by a recent study that was just published in the Public Library of Science 1 journal. Research coming out of the University of Toronto, which was looking at a large group of students, over 17,000 participants in this study, which took place over the internet based on voluntary gameplay, cast some serious doubt on the idea that self-control is tied to something akin to a daily willpower stockpile. Scientist Daniel Randles and his colleagues monitored two groups of students at 17-week intervals with 24-hour coverage over whether they logged into and participated in a learning task online. Students could log in whenever they wanted, persist at the task as long as they wanted. This was a cognitively demanding task. And so each sample session was monitored for the total time spent, the time of day that it was initiated, and the performance of the student within the task. These online tasks were learning tasks related to memory. You can kind of imagine something similar to the kids' game Memory that you're probably familiar with. And the researchers found that the time of day that the students selected to complete the task had almost no correlation to their actual performance. What it did correlate with was how long they actually stuck with the tasks, and this could be tied to any number of things, like how busy the average person is at certain times of day. About 7 a.m. was the lowest it ever went, and people would play the longest for games that were initiated about 9 p.m. And what the researchers did find very strongly was that performance on the task could be maintained for about an hour, after which time performance would start to drop if a person kept playing. All of this suggests that people tend to drop in motivation for a particular task after a period of time, but nothing about this suggests that overall self-control diminishes over the course of a day. Players' performance didn't really vary over the time that they started, but instead was just correlating with how long they'd been playing that particular session. This study did not consider the participants' demographics at all, nor did it gather any data on whether they actually enjoyed the task, both of which might be interesting things to further shade this data, but an interesting finding regardless, and hopefully motivate some more work into further studies on self-control and motivation.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title, twice.
Picked up a couple of 5-star reviews on iTunes. Listener JTomato2 from the USA says, informative, a great place to get original and unexpected information. And Emmy Ford 1 from the USA says, the range of guests touches on pretty much every subject related to nootropics and neuroscience. You'll enjoy the pre-interview news roundups, relevant product and sponsor info, and their infamous Ruthless Listener Retention gimmick. Well, a big thanks to both of you, and thanks to everyone also who answered my call to arms that I put out to send me an email last week with episode topic recommendations that you have for the coming months, the coming year. Still kind of a little bit early to start looking ahead to 2018, but you got to start sometime, and now's the time. The doors are by no means closed there. Definitely feel free to continue dropping emails on me if you haven't done so yet. Thanks to those those of you that have. Even weird ideas are welcome, as you know. We like to go pretty far afield on this show. We've got 200 episodes as of next week, so there's been a lot of room for off-the-beaten-path topics, and that's certainly not going to change. Sometimes we're exploring these random musings in the Smart Drug Smarts newsletter. That's also a place where we distribute some articles that we found interesting, the kind of things that might wind up being future episodes or maybe showing up on This Week in Neuroscience, but there's more research papers going out every week than we can put into the podcast, more stuff worth reading, and we like to use the footer of the newsletter as a little bit of a sprinkler system for information and links we think you'll like. You can get the Brain Breakfast coming to you by visiting smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter. Other things you could have coming to you, although by postal mail rather than email, are the stacks Nexus and Mitogen over at axonlabs.io, a couple of pills of which are in my system right now, as a matter of fact, although it's rare that that's not the case, and certainly not on a cognitively demanding day like today. But if you find yourself getting in the weeds with cognitive and creative work, and you haven't yet given Nexus a try, consider this a standing invitation. The shop never closes over at axonlabs.io. Smart Drug Smarts also has the supplement sponsor brand Vitamunk, which is quite a nice complement with a much wider range of products, covering everything from libido to longevity to joint aches and pains, everything in between. If they make a supplement for it, there's pretty good odds you're going to find something appropriate over at Vitamunk, and they're continuing to build out that lineup. Best recommendation there is to get on their email launch list for new products as they launch. You can find out the details or just enter your email address and see what happens over at smartdrugsmarts.com/launch.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So I'm about to be speaking with Dr. Martha Morris, who is a nutritional epidemiologist at Rush University and the primary researcher involved with creating the MIND diet. The MIND in Mind diet is an all-caps acronym short for the Mediterranean DASH diet, Intervention for Neurodegenerative Delay. So as you'll hear, somewhat of a fusion diet between the Mediterranean diet and DASH. DASH is an acronym itself, Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. But among the things that the MIND diet has going for it is a very strong showing, probably the current best guess as to the nutritional prevention of Alzheimer's, and even some pretty substantial benefits for those who only follow the diet moderately well, which inevitably will be a lot of people. Dietary compliance is obviously a super big issue when it comes to forming a diet, but according to the 2016 U.S. News and World Report Dietary Comparison, the MIND diet was actually tied for number 1 as being the easiest diets to follow the tenets of, tied for number 3 in healthy eating, and tied for number 2 in best diets overall. This raises the question of why it would only get number 3 for healthy eating if it might be the best diet for the brain. But we're about to hear how the MIND diet came about, what the diet actually involves as far as grocery shopping and food preparation, and importantly about the ongoing studies happening right now about how it actually performs in the field. So get ready to hear about the fruits of a whole lot of research, still a work in progress, still being studied as it should be. The MIND diet with Dr. Martha Morris.
I've been studying nutrition as it relates to brain health with aging for over 20 years. And these have all been in observational community cohort studies where we ask people living in the community to participate in our studies, and we evaluate them for all sorts of chronic conditions and diseases. And we also ask them many questions about lifestyle behaviors, including diet. So after many years of doing this type of research, we knew what were the important foods and nutrients for protecting the brain against brain aging and neurodegeneration and development of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And we felt it was about time, because no one had done it before, to actually test this in a clinical trial. And while we were designing that trial, we came to the big question of, well, what should we use in the way of a diet that incorporates all those things? And we struggled, well, do we use the Mediterranean diet? Do we use the DASH diet? What do we use? So we started out using the Mediterranean diet, and then I thought, what am I doing? All these years of research and knowing what were the important nutrients in foods, why don't we build on some basics of a healthy diet and incorporate all of those brain healthy nutrients into the diet? And that's how we came up with the MIND diet.
And this was officially unveiled, if I'm not mistaken, it was 2015?
Yes, in 2015, 2 publications were published in the journal Alzheimer's and Dementia. One related the MIND diet and also examined the Mediterranean and DASH diets in relation to risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. And the second looked at the MIND diet in comparison to the DASH and Mediterranean diets in relation to change in cognition with older age. And we found that the MIND diet was associated with a 53% reduction in the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease for people who were following the diet the most. But even people who had intermediate scores, they also had a 35% reduction in the risk of developing Alzheimer's. So it was really a very sensitive diet to protecting the brain. When we looked at the Mediterranean diet, the high scores on the Mediterranean diet actually performed just as well as those on the MIND diet, but there was no similar association with people who followed the Mediterranean diet just moderately. And then the DASH diet wasn't too different than either the Mediterranean or MIND diet, but not quite as protective. And then for the measurement of decline in cognitive abilities with older age, we found that the MIND diet, again, was much stronger, maybe had twice the effect on protecting the brain from decline than either the Mediterranean or DASH diets.
Whenever we talk about multiples, I'm always curious, like, what is the baseline there? How protective would the Mediterranean diet, for example, be for your average person?
Well, I guess the best way to answer that question would be to take our study on Alzheimer's disease. So compared with people who had very low scores on the MIND diet and controlling or adjusting for any differences in age, educational level, exercise level, cardiovascular conditions, all of those things, taking all of those into account. Compared to people who scored very low on the MIND diet, those who scored in the top third of scores had reduced their risk of developing Alzheimer's disease by more than half. But, it's not so different than what we've found for other diseases. Diet has been shown in large randomized trials to have a big impact on protecting us against diabetes. So it just makes good sense that it also would be so important for protecting your brain.
It's almost impossible to think of what the diet would look like that would be great for your cardiovascular system, but bad for the brain, or vice versa. It seems like those two always move in lockstep.
Yeah, and the Mediterranean, DASH, and MIND diets are really not all that different. They're pretty well correlated. But the MIND diet highlights foods that seem to have a lot of protection for the brain. One of them is green leafy vegetables. So neither the Mediterranean or the DASH diets separate out different types of vegetables. Their recommendations are 4 or more servings of vegetables in general per day. So we looked at the research that's been done, not just in our studies here at Rush, but worldwide, looked at them very carefully and saw that the level of benefit really begins at about 2 vegetable servings per day. And out of all the different types of vegetables, green leafy vegetables had the greatest protection for Alzheimer's or dementia or cognitive decline. And it was about 1 serving per day of green leafy vegetables. So for the MIND diet, we said 2 servings per day of vegetables, but 1 should be green leafy vegetables.
Is it fair to say, as a rule, that the darker green is going to beat the lighter green? Like iceberg lettuce, I guess, would be a classic example of something that technically is a vegetable, but probably doesn't have that much going for it nutritionally.
Absolutely. So we actually have a paper that will be published in the next year where we try to see what it is in green leafy vegetables that are so important for the brain. And the nutrients that we identified as being responsible for this green leafy vegetable association were lutein, vitamin E, folate, vitamin K, beta-carotene. All of those nutrients would be much more potent in dark green leafy vegetables like kale and spinach and collard greens, your very dark green leafy vegetables.
let's say somebody's coming off of the standard American diet. They hear this, they're like, you know what, I'm going to change my ways and sort of reboot my diet. How long might it be until some of the benefits that they can expect would sort of kick in? I mean, is this a months long process, a years long process, or is this something where you need to start when you're 10 years old and never look back?
That's a very good question that no one really has an answer to. We have an ongoing randomized clinical trial of the MIND diet. We've recruited about 100 of the 600 people so far, and our first participants are approaching the 6-month mark. We have put in measures of response to the diet at 3 months and again at 6 months. So based on the trial, we'll be able to see where does it kick in. I mean, we won't be able to tell sooner than 3-month mark, but we'll at least be able to answer it that way. But my actual thoughts on this have changed over time. I've been impressed by some shorter term, smaller trials that have done diet interventions. And it's amazing how so many changes occur at 3 weeks even. Studies that change fat composition in the diet are able to demonstrate changes in the cholesterol, the healthy and the unhealthy cholesterol levels at 3 weeks. So it's a question that I think is very interesting. I do believe people feel better almost immediately when they change their diet to a healthier diet.
So you've got a pretty good sample size in this study. Is it really just older people who eat, or is there anything more demographically specific about it than that?
We have 600 people that are in the current trial, and we're hoping to get a fair number of both men and women and people of different races. Our age groups are from 65 to 84. In our population studies, we have multiple ones here at Rush. Our smaller one is around 1,000 people. And then we have a large one that had up to, I think it was 5,000 or 6,000 where we had diet and cognitive decline in Alzheimer's disease measured on. And we haven't seen huge effects, if anything striking at all, by people of different gender or race. I guess one of the more interesting modifications of the diet effects we saw was for vitamin B12, which makes sense because the older we get, the harder it is for our body to absorb B12. And the older we get, the more likely we are to take antacids and other medications that change the acidity of the stomach, which affects B12 absorption. And we found that people who took vitamin supplements with B12 in the oldest age categories had the biggest protection against cognitive decline, whereas we didn't see that so much in people who were younger. Yeah, so there are some interesting differences by age, but I don't know if we'll be able to test them very well in this trial.
What are the primary biomarkers that you're going to be looking at throughout this study? I'm sure that you're gathering a whole lot of data, but are there particular expectations where you're anticipating big changes?
Our main outcome that is the outcome for the trial is change in performance on a battery of cognitive tests. So we'll be hoping to see that the MIND diet slows any kind of decline in people's performance cognitively. We're also having people get brain images, MRIs of their brain at baseline and at the end of the 3-year intervention. So we'll be looking to see whether different regions of the brain, in particular those involved in Alzheimer's disease, the shrinking of the brain might be less in people who are on the MIND diet. So those are our 2 primary outcomes. And then we're also measuring self-reported measures of diets and how their diets might change. But in addition, we are collecting blood samples and urine samples, and in some participants, even stool samples throughout the trial. So we'll be able to look at levels of different nutrients biochemically. So we're looking at antioxidant nutrients, all of the vitamin E, the tocopherol forms, carotenoids, which would include lutein and beta-carotene. We're looking at fatty acids and blood cholesterol. We're looking at hemoglobin A1C for diabetic changes. We're looking at a great deal nutrient and other nutritional biomarkers.
Do you think that, I'm allowing you to speculate here, I realize this is just a guess, but do you think that there might be any people that might actually see an improvement over their baselines, even though they are getting 3 years older, just depending on the type of diet that they're coming into the study from?
That would be ideal, wouldn't it? I guess it's possible. We'll be very interested to see whether that happens. Another set of measures that we'll be looking at, because the Mind Diet is so new, very few people have studied it thus far, but we'll also be looking at any changes in cardiovascular type measures, like is there a reduction in blood pressure? Is there a reduction in high blood cholesterol levels or insulin changes and weight changes, of course? So we'll be looking at many things.
3 years is a long enough study where I wonder what would happen if somebody decided to start a new exercise regimen halfway through the study. Are they sort of signing a Scout's honor, I won't do anything in the rest of my lifestyle that might interfere with this nutritional study? Or how does that work exactly?
Yeah, we tell our participants that this is such an important trial. There are so many people out there that want to know whether changing their diet will have a protective effect. And so they're scientists along with us. And to make this science work, they have to be very diligent at following all of the diet changes that we ask them to make, but at the same time, not to change other things in their lifestyle that might also impact the disease. So we ask them not to do that. We measure all of those things so we can see who changes and who doesn't. But of course, we can't really control that.
If you find that somebody has started an extreme exercise program halfway through, do you just throw those out and say this person's data will need to cast aside and not pollute the overall data set?
No, that would not be a good way to analyze our data. For the most part, the usual case in these kinds of trials is that it's random. Maybe some people in one group and some people in the other group make those changes, and it's usually small. But we're keeping very close watch on whether there are any of those kinds of changes.
I'd love to zero in for a second on whole grains, which are one of the big recommendations within the Mind Diet and probably one of the largest areas where my personal diet diverges. I have not eaten grains in a number of years. Occasionally rice, but we're really pretty strict paleo or very close to it. But of course, I'm willing to adjust course if I'm wrong. I would love to hear about the inclusion of whole grains, why they made the cut.
Whole grains are good sources of B vitamins as well as vitamin E. And those two classes of nutrients have been shown individually to be important for preserving the brain. Other than that, there really isn't a body of literature that says the category whole grains will protect your brain. However, there is a lot of scientific evidence to show that whole grains are protective against heart disease and also diabetes. And whole grains are a very important component of the Mediterranean diet, which also has been related to lower risk of cardiovascular conditions. Those are the sets of reasons why we specified whole grains.
What are your thoughts on seasonal variation within a diet? Nowadays, most of us have access to whatever food we want year-round, despite it being in season or out of season, which is kind of a new thing in human nutritional history. What are your thoughts there? Is there any lesson to be learned one way or the other?
The truth is, we don't have very good data on how much impact seasonality of foods has on human health. You know, that brings up a very interesting conundrum that I've been dealing with in the last year or so. I don't believe that there should be one group of food or one diet pattern that we should ask everyone in the world to adopt. There's going to be differences by culture. And if you think of the environment, one of the elements of the Mind Diet study, for example, are berries. And this might not be a very practical economically or shipping to a far-off country from any berry source. But is there something local that would serve the same purpose as the berries? And I think that this should be the focus of nutritional research going forward. And, that probably answers to some degree that question about seasonality. So are there foods during the winter that are winter-friendly vegetables or seasonal-friendly vegetables that can counterbalance other foods that are available in another time of year? I think we have a long ways to go to address some of these more environmentally and economically friendly questions.
I can see the intuitive appeal of thinking that people, over a certain number of generations, you're going to get somewhat adapted to the foods that are available in your area. If your lineage is entirely from sub-Saharan Africa versus somebody who their lineage is an Inuit person, their ancestors have been living for who knows how many generations up in the Arctic Circle eating a diet of seal blubber. At some point, you'd think that would start to apply some genetic pressures. I mean, have you seen any differences at the population levels between what different people might respond best to?
It's interesting. There's a study in the dementia world, an ongoing longitudinal cohort study of a Nigerian population and then an Indiana African American population. And the risk of dementia was 3 times higher in the Indianapolis population, even though the socioeconomic status and medical and environmental sophistication of the Nigerian population was much different. And there's huge diet and exercise differences between the two populations. The Nigerian population was mainly a diet of tubers and grains and fish. That seemed to serve them very well. So I think we should direct our attention to what in this culture, in this region, is the healthiest diet.
What are some of the major no-nos? I mean, obviously, eating Skittles for breakfast is not on anybody's list, but what would you say are the main things that a person should avoid while adhering to the MIND diet?
So far, the strongest evidence points to the composition of the fat in the diet. So having a fat composition that is higher in the monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats and lower in the saturated fats is the driving force. So based on that, we listed 5 food groups in the MIND diet to limit. We didn't say never eat these foods. We said limit these foods because they will contribute to higher saturated and trans fats. So that would be red meat and red meat products, fast foods, especially fried foods, pastries and sweets, and butter and cheese are among those food categories to limit.
There's a vocal and growing community of interest right now, I think, in ketogenic diets, predominated by fat as far as the macronutrient ratio, and a lot of people very unapologetically eating saturated fats, confident that the brain is functioning just as well, if not better. And recommending whole grains to a ketogenic person is like recommending garlic to a vampire. I know that the keto community probably will get its hackles up at some of the recommendations in the MIND diet. I would love to hear your response to that, if this is an unbridgeable gulf or if there might be some areas of commonality.
I have a couple of responses to that. The first one that comes to mind is right now we don't know what effects the ketogenic diet has on dementia and how healthy it is for people who are healthy and want to protect their brain with age. There is a clinical trial, and there's good reason to believe that maybe the ketogenic diet would be a healthier diet in people with Alzheimer's disease because the brain in Alzheimer's disease has problems using glucose as its source of energy. So having a ketogenic diet offers another source of energy for the brain to function. There's no scientific data yet to support that theory. There is an ongoing clinical trial, and we'll just have to wait to see if that's the case, if it is effective. Now, that's an Alzheimer's brain that is very different than a healthy brain that can use glucose to function. So, yes, it's possible that the ketogenic diet would be a better diet in some people. We have to have the scientific evidence that tests this directly. Now, the Inuit diet was very high in omega-3 fatty acids, which is a type of polyunsaturated fat, which is very healthy. And that really swings the fat composition of that particular population to higher unsaturated fat to saturated fat.
When we're talking about Alzheimer's and dementia, we're necessarily talking about older age groups. Is there any reason to think that what might be an optimal diet for a person's brain in their youth might differ from older populations?
It's very difficult to study because, you would really want to take it from what are children eating and then carry them all the way through their diets to when they get old and what are they eating then. And so within the same person, looking at different effects is a very long study. But there are some things that we are finding are very constant. For example, the omega-3 fatty acids. The research on omega-3 fatty acids started in utero development and then the first years of life. And they were found to be very important for brain development. And it wasn't until after the year 2000 where there were more studies looking at the aging brain and also found omega-3 fatty acids to be very important for the aging brain. Yes, there's probably differences by age group, but we just don't have enough evidence to be certain about complete diets, how complete diets may be different. We do know certain nutrients have different effects at different ages.
What might we know nutritionally 5 or 10 years from now that we don't know now? I think a lot of people look at where science is at and that we're in the year 2017 and starting to think about mining asteroids and stuff like that. And yet nutrition, this thing that, people have been eating food and it's been something that everybody's doing forever. And yet there still is a surprising lack of consensus. Are we going to see an acceleration of progress with some of the new tools that we have at our disposal, personal genomics and stuff like that? Or is nutrition just sort of inherently a slow to progress field?
I think that there is not a more complex field than nutrition, and that's part of the problem. We're still discovering biologically active components in foods. And then when we discover them, then we have to understand how are they absorbed? Are they used by any organs? Or what kind of effect do they have on organs? How do we measure them accurately? That's happened with polyphenols. There's thousands of them. And that includes things like flavonoids, which we are identifying as being components of wine and teas and chocolate. Those are fairly newly discovered. So there's just a lot to know and understand. And then there's also what happens when you have medication use or different diseases. Are there different needs for those nutrients during those times? So yeah, it's a very complex field. It's endless what we need to learn.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on GMO foods, and I guess I'll pick blueberries because blueberries are one of the things that's highlighted as being a part of the Mind diet. But to what extent is a blueberry versus GMO blueberries or certified organic blueberries? What other aspects of food preparation or food manufacture does a person need to consider beyond just the name on the ingredients list?
Wow, that's a loaded question. Just taking the berries as an example, when you are talking about the nutrient composition of a food, it's done in a laboratory, and that's how we know what the nutrient content is of a food. Each laboratory has varying levels of sophistication in measuring accurately the nutrients. And then if you consider all the different varieties and ways of processing the blueberries, all of those have to be tested in the laboratory. So it's not a simple answer, and it's very expensive. We do know, however, that when you pick a berry in the field, there is a point of its growth where it has optimum nutritional value. So that's a window of time. So if you consider the berries are usually picked early, right? And then they make their way through distribution to stores. They sit in the stores. You buy them. You leave them in your refrigerator for a certain period of time. So the nutrient content of the berry picked in the field to when you might consume it is very different. Frozen berries, the farmers pick the berries at their optimum nutritional value and then immediately blanch them, which is a fast freeze. Those are probably more nutritious than if the berry has been picked at a non-nutritionally optimal time, and then there's a very long period between when the berry was picked and you consume it. But if you walk outside your door and you pick the berries, they're optimum, you're getting the most nutritious berry, even more so than the berry that was frozen.
You mentioned the 600-person longitudinal study that you have ongoing now is something that you're currently working on. Any other research that you have in the works or on the drawing board that you'd like to talk about?
Well, I am involved in some studies that are in the works, intervention trials that will test effects of diet with and without other types of behavior changes. And I think that is a new thing. The world, and in particular the U.S., has been very reluctant to study diet and its impact on health. It's more the drug approach. And ignoring findings, there was a trial done within the last 10 years that pitted the DASH diet against metformin to prevent pre-diabetics from becoming diabetic. The success was far greater in the diet intervention arm than in the drug arm. Yet there's not that much effort in the medical community to lead with diet to prevent chronic diseases. And I'm so thrilled that there's now a new enthusiasm with funding agencies to consider diet as a prevention of these chronic diseases.
I've talked with so many medical doctors that talk about compliance being a problem, even when it's a really serious condition that somebody has, and even when the intervention is just taking a pill and remembering to take a pill once or twice a day. It's something which seems like it really wouldn't be that hard. By contrast, that seems really easy compared to convincing somebody to learn a new diet, change their lifelong food habits. I mean, is that a lot of the problem, you think, with the funding agencies just saying that even if we find the right diet, getting the public to comply is going to be sort of fighting an uphill battle?
It's not just the funding agencies, it's the scientists that sit on the review committees to score the grants that are behavioral interventions like diet. They have a bias against diet. I think that is a very important component of the success of a diet intervention, and we spend a lot of our resources on that very point, compliance. But I think the real problem in the medical field is that they're not reimbursed by insurance companies to have their patients see a dietitian, but they are reimbursed for visits where they prescribe drugs and insurance company reimbursed for drugs. The second important component to that are that physicians are not trained to assess diet and how to modify a diet. They're trained in drugs and prescribing drugs. So they're going to go with their training. I think many of them would prescribe a dietitian if the insurance companies were to provide for the adequate number of visits to a dietitian that's required to change a person's lifestyle.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So a big thank you to Dr. Martha Morris for taking the time for that conversation. I think that dietary changes are probably right up there with public speaking as far as most people's greatest fears. People just don't like mucking with their diet. But of course, the diet is one of the biggest ratchets that we have for changing both our physical and cognitive health for good or ill. The frustrating fact with humans being the long-lived species that we are, every new roll of the dice to try to find a cause and effect relationship takes literally years, possibly decades, to really find out the long-term consequences. But science is certainly giving us an increasingly tantalizing array of clues, better information than any other human generation has ever had before as far as what we should be eating. Also worth mentioning, Dr. Morris, or actually this is Dr. Morris's daughter, who is a chef. She has a book coming out, which is basically a recipe book and a guide for actually living and eating according to the Mind Diet. It's called Diet for the Mind. It's not going to be available until December of this year, but it's available on Amazon now for pre-order. We'll put up a link to that on the page for this episode, smartdrugsmarts.com/199. But if you want a recipe book, sure to include some blueberries. That book may be a good option.
Smart Drug Smarts, ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So way back in 1872, Charles Darwin was the first person to describe disgust as one of the basic emotions. And since that time, science has described disgust as being characterized by a peculiar facial expression and action of distancing oneself from an offensive object, a distinctive physical manifestation, nausea, and an identifiable feeling of revulsion, all of which are things we'd like to personally avoid but are nonetheless worthy of study. Studies on learned aversion to certain foods have been rare due to ethical issues associated with making people eat eat things they don't like, especially because a lot of those have to do with food allergies and learned associations of nasty gastrointestinal consequences. However, researchers thought that they saw a rare opportunity with cheese because this is a food group that is described as disgusting by apparently a non-trivial number of people. Prior to reading this study, I thought I was kind of alone out there, but apparently not so much. And this study was actually conducted based on the French population. France is a famously cheese-friendly culture, and yet even in France, they were able to find a significant portion of the population, some 6% of individuals that rated cheese as a 0 on a 0 out of 10 desirability scale for food. 11.5% put cheese somewhere in the 0 to 3 range, which was still enough to count as having induced disgust as far as the researchers were concerned. For the brain scanning that was part of this fMRI-based study, they had a sample pool of people that had responded to a newspaper ad and rated how much they liked or disliked certain foods, which included a lot of different types of food. Cheese was sort of camouflaged among this much larger group. And then for the brain portion, they found 15 healthy right-handed subjects who liked cheese and 15 healthy right-handed subjects who disliked cheese. They got them all strapped up to all sorts of metrics, sensor-equipped sort of girdles that could tell how much a person was inhaling and exhaling, so you could tell how deeply somebody would inhale a certain aroma, a finger keypad so you could type with your fingers on how much or how little you liked a certain smell. And then they also ran people through a couple of different scenarios, having them indicate how much they liked or wanted a food, distinguishing between those two. And finally, they masked people up so they could then inject certain smells into their breathing mask. And the stimuli included 6 different cheese varieties. These were blue cheese, cheddar cheese, goat cheese, something called Gruyere. I might be pronouncing that wrong. Parmesan and Tom cheese, and 6 non-cheese foods, cucumber, fennel, mushroom, pate, peanut, and pizza. And they were smelling the same foods 7 times per food per session in a randomized order. Sometimes they were given only a smell cue, and sometimes they were presented the smell cue along with a photo of the food that they were smelling. They were never trying to fool them by showing them a smell of one thing and a picture of something else, but sometimes they were just using the photo to sort of prompt the memory or see if visual learning about what this food looked like would prompt a slightly different reaction within the brain than merely the smell. For each stimulus, the subjects were asked to provide a response as soon as they had performed their liking or wanting judgment, and the researchers considered both the scores that the participants provided and also the response time it took them to give those scores. The fMRI results showed that a brain structure called the globus pallidus was deeply involved in both reward and disgust, along with the substantia nigra and the ventral tegmental area. Previous animal and human studies have shown that both the globus pallidus and the substantia nigra are involved with reward circuits in the brain that motivate behavior, but this study showed that these same areas are more strongly activated by people who dislike cheese when those people are exposed to cheese odors than in people who like cheese, suggesting that these regions can go both ways and dictate positive or negative feelings towards foods. The researchers saw that within the anti-cheese group, the negative scores in liking and wanting the smells of cheeses dropped substantially further when people saw as well as just smelled the cheeses. The pictures really seemed to add something to the level of disgust. They also saw, probably not surprisingly, that people tend to inhale less deeply when exposed to a smell that they don't like. But again, breathing became even shallower when they saw a picture in addition to just smelling the smell. And overall finding that not only is there a thin line between love and hate, but apparently a lot of the same structures involved when it comes to controlling how we love or hate different foods.
Just say no to scratch that. Say yes to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Join our mailing list at www.smartdrugsmarts.com.
Okay, so that is it for episode number 199 of Smart Drug Smarts. Next week will be our Duplo Centennial edition, or whatever you call that. But if you're curious about the Mind Diet or the links to anything that we've talked about in this week's show, you can find that up online at smartdrugsmarts.com/199. If you missed last week's episode in 198, I spoke with Dr. Dan Romer about the teenage brain. A little bit of a defense of the teenage brain. Those crazy teenagers might not be so bad after all. And next week's episode, well, next week is number 200, so you'll just have to come back, see what we've got planned. There will be appropriate kazoos and fanfare and dog-paddling mice, gambling simians, copulating fruit flies, everything that you might expect from a good Smart Drug Smarts episode. I will see you back here for that next Friday, same time, same podcast, and with the same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week in the meantime, and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.